Again, we're just letting everybody in, so we will start the discussion properly in literally just a minute. So just please be patient. You have a little bit of time to go and get your coffee or tea, depending on where you are, and we will start in a minute. Okay, we already have more than 100 people, and it seems the numbers keep rising, but it's already 2 minutes past the time we're supposed to start, so we're gonna go ahead. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. Welcome to the Land Dialogue webinar series. It is being organized in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Thin. I'm a journalist specializing in food systems and climate change issues, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. Now, this is the first Land Dialogue discussion for this year, and we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. What this means is that instead of having a 90-minute session, we are going to have a 60-minute webinar. Now, don't worry, there is time set aside still for Q&A, and we're also going to be keeping a lookout for interesting questions that I'm sure will come up during the discussion, and we'll see if we can fit them in even before the Q&A starts. Now, the idea behind this whole webinar series is to raise awareness on the land rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is because these rights are a prerequisite to achieve national and international goals around many, many things. And those include forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. Now, there will be 4 land dialogues in total this year, and each one will be focusing on a different topic. Now, before I get into today's discussion topic, I would like to just go through a few housekeeping rules. First, this webinar is in English, but we have simultaneous translations in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Bahasa Indonesia. To access your translation, all you have to do is to go to this little globe icon that you can see at the bottom of your Zoom window. Now you can click on it and then select the language that you want. Like I said earlier, the webinar will last 60 minutes. We have about 10-15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. However, please use the chat box to let us know who you are, which organization you belong to, and where you're joining us from. Also, please feel free to tweet using the hashtag #LandDialogues. That's just one word, #LandDialogues. And you can also follow the live tweets from Land Portal and Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. Finally, we're also recording today's session, and we will share the link with all of you later. Now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's turn to today's topic, and that is taking data back, women's sovereignty over land data. Now, we so often hear these days about how important data is, right? That data is the new oil. So we want to better understand where the current model of data science is and whether it includes and reflects the realities of Indigenous women and their land rights. We want to know whether they are able to participate in data collection and use, particularly when that data is about them and their land tenure. And if they can't participate, we want to know why and how this can be remedied, how they can take back control. Now, it's important that we define a couple of key terms before starting this discussion, because you're going to be hearing these terms throughout today's conversation. And the first term is Indigenous Data Sovereignty, or IDS for short. And this refers to the right of Indigenous peoples to control data from and about their communities and lands, articulating both individual and collective rights to data access and to privacy. The second term is called data feminism. Now, this is a framework for thinking about data science and ethics that is guided by ideas of intersectional feminism. The work of data feminism uncovers how standard practices in data science, how they serve to reinforce existing inequalities around the world. We're going to be sharing some of the links about these terms in the chat box, so keep your chat box open. Now I'm going to introduce you to our speakers who are going to help us understand the whole debate around data better. In the interest of fairness, I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Now, first we have Betty Rubio, who is a Quechua leader. Unfortunately, Betty is in the field at the moment and we haven't been able to reach her, so she might not be able to join us today. However, we do have Danik Priyati, who is Director of Vishnu Foundation in Indonesia. Now, Danik has been involved in grassroots activities for over 25 years, and she's an expert when it comes to organizing local communities, village planning, customary village empowerment, and community-based ecotourism. We then have Lydia Jennings, who is a Native American soil microbiologist and an environmental scientist. Lydia's conducted research on soil health, environmental remediation, indigenous science, and environmental data ownership by tribal nations. Lydia is currently a presidential postdoctoral fellow at the School of Sustainability and the Nicholas School of the Environment. And last but definitely not the least is Rudo Kemper, who is Chief Program Officer at the Cadesta Foundation. Rudo is a geographer and a technologist, and he has over a decade of experience supporting Indigenous communities in mapping and monitoring their lands, and also to build digital tools that increase community self-determination, access to land rights, and land management capabilities. Now, I've already talked far too much, so I'm going to turn to the experts and then ask them a couple of rounds of questions. And I really encourage them to respond to each other's answers and to build on them. My only request is to keep your answers to maximum 2 to 3 minutes. Now, again, to the audience, please use the Q&A box to send your questions. And it would be great if you could also identify yourself and your organization. Now, Danik, can I turn to you first? I would like you to sort of help us set the scene in terms of what is happening right now, you know, when it comes to data, because you have extensive experience working with local Indigenous communities. Can you tell us, you know, who is collecting this data, who has access, who doesn't, and what are some of the main problems? Danik, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm sorry, my internet is trouble. Okay.
No.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Ya, ya. Sudah tadi internet saya putus. Maaf. Tadi saya bisa diulangi, Mbak Intan, pertanyaannya?
No problem. I was just asking Danik to sort of help set the scene, you know, in terms of what's happening right now when it comes to data collection, who's doing it, you know, who has access and who doesn't. What are some of the problems that Indigenous women in particular are facing right now when it comes to data?
Baik, terima kasih. Mohon maaf saya tidak menyalakan video karena internet tidak bagus di sini karena saya berada di desa. Terima kasih atas kesempatannya, tim, dan terkait dengan data. Saat ini masih di Indonesia, terutama di Bali, masih banyak dikuasai atau dilakukan oleh pemerintah. Nah, jadi semua data-data tanah terkait dengan pertanahan itu masih ada dalam kendali pemerintah. Jadi bagaimana perempuan dapat mengakses data itu sangat tergantung daripada kemampuan dari perempuan, dan juga terkait dengan tanah di Bali itu tidak hanya sekedar ekonomi atau fisik, tapi juga terkait dengan sosial budaya. Dan ini hal-hal ini sebenarnya yang sekarang yang menjadi persoalan di Bali adalah sertifikasi pribadi terhadap tanah-tanah yang ada di Bali, sehingga ini menyebabkan banyak akses perempuan terhadap tanah terutama, dan juga masyarakat adat terhadap tanah itu juga mulai kacau dan mulai tergerus karena investasi pariwisata yang sangat masif di Bali. Itu mungkin dari saya. Terima kasih.
No, that's really helpful to give the very specific example from Bali. Rudo, can I bring you in because you've worked with a lot of Indigenous groups? What are some of the problems you are currently seeing right now? What are some of the issues?
Yeah, certainly. So thanks, Finn, and hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with you today. Yeah, so thinking about this question of setting the stage, I think of a lot of my experience working with Indigenous communities, especially in the Amazon region in South America, where the villages are very remote and the community members have had limited access to technology. And I definitely, what Denik said around it, most of the initiatives have been government-led until very recently. I see that happening in the Amazon as well. But one of the more interesting recent trends is that you do start to see a lot of community-driven data collection processes taking place, because community members have found the need to collect their own data or make their own maps to be able to counter the maps that either the government has or that outside interests like extractive industries, have, which shows a lot of data like concessions over the land, but it doesn't show any of the indigenous knowledge or any of the community's perspective on what their land looks like. So community members are starting to do more data collection. And some of that is also due to the increasing availability of, easy to use smartphone applications for data collection and mapping. And that's really good. But there is kind of a disconnect and an incompleteness about the data cycle that I've seen, that I think a lot more work needs to be done on, because you have community members, including women, that are involved in data collection, but then there's a gap once that data has been collected and has to be submitted somewhere to be processed. And that's where I start to see that a lot of the communities have less and less control or autonomy over that process, because it has to be sent somewhere. The internet, for example, in which case if a community is remote or offline, they don't have access to that data, or there's a latency, they don't have access to it for months. Frequently an outside party like an NGO or a researcher, or sometimes even the government, has to get involved in helping process some of that data or analyze it. And so you start to see less and less control by the community over the data once it has been collected. So in terms of the data cycle, there's still a lot of incompleteness and gaps. And I think also in terms of Indigenous women, their level of access to that data gets to be diminished as well, as more dominant interests within the community might be the only parties that are receiving that data once it has been processed or collected as well. So I think there's some promising trends in terms of the increasing availability of access to data collection tools, but there's still a lot of gaps. Maybe I'll start with that.
Thanks, Rudo. Lydia, I saw you nodding when both Danik and Rudo were talking, and I just want to give you, before I go back into Danik, if you wanted to add anything. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think both have made really important points. I also just want to make sure that we are more expansive on what we consider as data. And so I think when we talk about data science and a lot of these conversations about land data, we tend to think through this very colonial lens of these binary numbers that are collected, and really making sure that we step back and are reflective that data is inclusive of our languages, of our locations of sacred ecosystems, of our relationships to our human and non-human kin. And that's a really important piece that Indigenous women have always held in different capacities and are typically part of the dominant narrative of data. And so as we talk about today in this conversation of women being knowledge and data experts, it's really important to recognize that in different cultures, and I think of my own, the type of knowledge and data that women are experts in might be different than the men. And it's not because of gender disparities, it's because we recognize that we each have different roles as knowledge keepers and knowledge experts. And so really making sure that we're expansive as we talk about these pieces in this conversation today.
Great, thank you, Lydia. Danik, I want to come to you, and that sort of links to what you talked earlier about, Indigenous women and the cultural values, and also, sort of linked to what Lydia just talked about, how we see data as well. How, when we, you talked about the challenges, in Bali, in Indonesia in particular, your experience, how could, this collection of land-related data could be done in a way that reflects cultural values, right? Because I think you talked about, and I think Lydia also talked about just now, as women as the center of, data and these values. Danik, could you, how can this be, how can data can be collected in a way that reflects cultural values for Indigenous women?
Baik, terima kasih. Kalau di Bali, mungkin sebelum saya menjelaskan bagaimana data dikumpulkan, saya ingin menjelaskan bahwa soal data tanah atau wilayah di Bali itu, karena orang Bali itu, bagaimana hubungan orang Bali terhadap tanah atau wilayahnya. Nah, karena orang Bali itu punya prinsip atau punya keyakinan bahwa makrokosmos dan mikrokosmos ini adalah sesuatu yang sama. 5 elemen pembentuk semesta ini sama dengan kita, pembentuk diri manusia, sehingga manusia Bali, masyarakat Bali, terutama masyarakat adat, berkewajiban untuk memelihara alam semesta, terutama Ibu Pertiwi, karena tanah itu disebut Ibu Pertiwi di Bali. Nah, seiring dengan perubahan zaman, dulu leluhur kami sudah membuat sebenarnya sangat arif dalam bagaimana mengatur soal wilayah atau tata ruang desa atau pekarangan rumah tangga dan perkampungan yang kami sebut dengan Trimandala. Nah, di mana kawasan suci, di mana kawasan pemukiman, di mana kawasan peruntukan untuk penghidupan. Nah, itu sudah diatur. Tapi sejak zaman kemerdekaan, sejak zaman penjajahan dan kemerdekaan, bahkan pemerintah Indonesia atas nama kepentingan pembangunan untuk masyarakat dan juga terutama untuk investasi, untuk pembangunan, ini nilai-nilai budaya ini di Bali mulai kacau. Desa adat, ada desa dinas, dan ini mulai ada kekacauan di Bali, sehingga masyarakat Bali yang memiliki prasasti, yang kami sebut dengan prasasti ditulis di atas daun lontar, lempengan logam, batu, itu tidak bisa berbicara dengan pemerintah, karena pemerintah tidak mengakui hal itu sebagai sesuatu yang memang harus dibuktikan kebenarannya. Nah, jadi tidak valid menurut undang-undang pertanahan. Maka adalah sertifikasi tanah di Bali, sehingga di Indonesia tahu undang-undang UPA itu, sehingga itu yang menyebabkan banyak sengketa dan banyak carut-marut soal pertanahan. Nah, sejak perubahan kebijakan di Indonesia dan pemerintahan Indonesia, zaman reformasi, kami mulai untuk melakukan pemetaan partisipatif. Pemetaan partisipatif seperti yang disampaikan oleh Pak Rudo tadi, bahwa bagaimana masyarakat mulai mengenali dirinya, mulai mengenali wilayahnya, dan mulai mengenali seluruh apa yang mereka miliki dengan sendiri, bukan dengan sendirinya, bukan oleh orang lain, bukan dikatakan oleh orang lain, tapi harus dengan diri sendiri. Maka kami dari Yayasan Wisnu sejak tahun 99 mulai mendampingi masyarakat desa untuk memahami tentang keruangan mereka. Nah, dan apa yang kami lakukan, ya mulai melakukan pengorganisasian masyarakat, baik dari tingkat desa, terutama desa adat dengan anak-anak muda, dan untuk membangun pemahaman dan kesepakatan-kesepakatan terkait dengan apa yang mereka miliki. Nah, dari situ desa dan kami membangun kesepakatan dengan desa, bagaimana langkah-langkah yang harus kami lakukan dan seperti apa mereka menghadapi sekarang realita yang zaman globalisasi ini, dan mungkin dunia sudah tahu bagaimana investasi pariwisata di Bali ini sangat menggerus sebenarnya, mulai masuk ke ranah-ranah adat yang bagi masyarakat Bali, kalau kami bilang itu terlambat untuk mengantisipasi. Nah, jadi derasnya arus pariwisata juga menjadikan masyarakat Bali lupa akan apa yang pernah digariskan oleh leluhur, sehingga itu kami mulai untuk ingatkan kembali, mulai kami gali kembali dengan masyarakat desa yang masih sangat di desa-desa adat kami yang masih sangat taat pada aturan-aturan adat mereka. Nah, kami mulai memetakan dengan anak-anak muda dan perempuan. Nah, di sini ada pembagian peran antara perempuan dan anak muda laki-laki. Nah, kalau anak muda laki-laki itu biasanya dia akan dengan sendirinya memilih keliling desanya. Keliling desanya berjalan langsung, dan kalau anak perempuannya akan memilih untuk mengumpulkan data sosial budayanya. Nah, di sini keterlibatan antara, di sini ada transfer knowledge, transfer pengetahuan dari orang tua kepada anak muda dengan sendirinya. Nah, di situ terjadi dialog antara anak muda dengan orang tua, dan perempuan sangat karena data sosial budaya ini paling banyak diketahui oleh perempuan. Mungkin itu sementara. Terima kasih, Tin.
Terima kasih banyak, Danik. Lydia, can I come to you next? You know, Danik talked about how they're doing to try and ensure that, right, the collection is, you know, reflecting cultural values. But what about in terms of practicalities of just, you know, trying to take back that land-related data? Can this be done? If so, how?
Yeah, I find a lot of inspiration that looking at the scores of Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholars who are really working to both reclaim their data of their communities and also make sure policies in the future really assert their rights to have access to that, to have governance authority over that types of data. And I think it's really important that we contextualize that a lot of data and material culture that about Indigenous peoples and our sacred ecosystems has been collected through very colonial expedition processes. And so there's both in the museum center of going back and reclaiming ancestors that are housed in museums, but then also going through and retroactively looking at databases that are collecting information about Indigenous peoples' lands and ecosystems. So I work with the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance at the University of Arizona. And I think what's really powerful about this collaboratory is we have Indigenous scholars from a variety of different disciplines. We've had Bruto come in and talk to our group before, and really look at how people in a variety of different disciplines are thinking about how do we embed Indigenous governance and Indigenous rights into data infrastructures, into policies, and utilize this to support Indigenous sovereignty in every capacity. And so I think it's those types of partnerships and recognizing them, that they translate across political boundaries that are often not boundaries we assign or not boundaries that ecosystems assign, to really ensure that we can support one another and learn from one another's examples and develop technologies and data infrastructures that really assign rights embedded within them. And so you see some great examples happening here in the United States right now. The University of Maine has an eDNA program, right? So any environmental DNA samples that are being collected in the program itself, it will actually send a notification to the tribal nations that it was collected from and let their tribal historic preservation officer know about these programs or these projects happening. And so we need to really be thinking about, as researchers, as community scholars, how do we start facilitating and building more programs like that and technologies like that, to make sure that when we as an environmental scientist or a cultural anthropologist are collecting information about Indigenous peoples, they are not just a collaborator, they are leading those pieces. They are knowing what's happening and telling us how good our data is. Because I think this is a really lost piece, is that this is partially how I was trained. We don't enough learn from the Indigenous peoples whose lands we're working on and with. And I think it really hinders our scientific process, because we know Indigenous knowledges have gone through the ultimate peer review process of being tested across millennia of generations. But that is often really lost in our today's contemporary peer review process. It's only 3 people who are trained to think the same way. And so I think making sure that we can embed this into the practices, into the data infrastructures, is a really vital piece of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That's really interesting, particularly, the examples that you gave. But also, can I just reiterate, I've been requested by the interpreters to try and slow down the speed of our speech. I know, whenever I get excited and, really into the topic that I'm talking about, I tend to speak faster and faster. So I guess just to take a deep breath and slow it down again so the interpreters can follow everything that we're saying. Rudo, I'm coming back to you. And my question is actually, because you talked about the challenges, and I was going to ask you about what can be done to include Indigenous women in the data cycle, in a way that's respectful. But there are quite a few questions that are already coming, addressing to you. So I also want to throw a couple of them to you in case you are also able to address them in your answer. And essentially, you talked about the lack of autonomy the first time when I was asking you to set the scene. So if you can perhaps, they're asking, can you expand on the point you made about not having autonomy, Rudo, and the challenges also on the land data collection in areas dominated by Indigenous communities? What is the role of the woman in those particular issues? So I'm sorry asking you to condense 3 questions in one, but I'll give you an extra minute or 2 more to answer that. So, perhaps, again, you might still need to set the scene a little bit more and then talk about what can be done to include women in the data cycle. All yours.
Will do. Okay. Yeah, so maybe first just starting with a quick reflection on what we mean by a data cycle, right, when we talk about Indigenous communities. And I think there's a lot of alignment here also with what Denik and Lydia just said. And I think if you, disentangle data from any modern constructs and take data to just mean knowledge, then you'll find that communities have always had their data cycles about their land, right? For example, in the form of oral histories or through practical teachings on harvesting and planting, or, the example from Bali that Denik brought out. So spatial knowledge that's inscribed onto palm leaves. And at least for all of the Indigenous communities that I've had the fortune of working with, women have always had a strong role in those data cycles. So first, just to mention that to maybe set the stage a little bit. But right, so as Denik pointed out, the problem arises when those Indigenous data cycles are somehow invalidated by outside actors who come in with their own worldview and conception of data, such as that of geospatial data shown on maps, which is why for Indigenous communities, they found it really useful and powerful to collect spatial data using some of the same tools. To be able to stake out a claim and defend customary and collective right to traditional lands. So, in terms of how to include Indigenous women in some of these data cycles that may involve using something like digital tools for participatory mapping, I think there's a few things to consider. One is that it's important to design the project in such a way that Indigenous women can be included in the data stewardship process at every step of the way. As I mentioned before, there's some incompleteness there. A lot of the community mapping process tends to only be inclusive during the data collection phase. And that's where the question of autonomy and perhaps reduced autonomy comes into play. And some of that has to do with the technology, right? The fact that the technology only lends itself to that initial process of data collection, but that afterwards there is a lack of access to that level of data and therefore a reduction in the overall autonomy over the ownership of that data, at least for remote communities. So to answer that question that came in there. And so once it progresses to this kind of analysis or decision-making phase, there's much less representation. And the perspective of women in particular tends to be muted out by more dominant voices in that process. So in terms of project design, being able to find a way that Indigenous women can be included throughout the entire process is, I think, really key. But it's worth pointing out that even during the data collection phase, it can be a challenge, frankly, to achieve the full participation. Often women in Indigenous communities and other local communities as well carry a higher level of responsibility for domestic or agricultural work. And so when mapping trainings or workshops are organized, they're not always able to come or only able to come a few times. And at a certain point, it tends to be either the younger people or the men that take over that process, and then ends up leads to this unequal transmission of knowledge, right? So even though the project design was intended to be kind of more democratic and inclusive, in practice, it doesn't always play out that way, right? So it's important to ensure that any planned activities are grounded in these practical realities of daily life in the community. And if you are implementing a participatory mapping project, to think about maybe extra investments to be made so that to ensure that women can participate in these activities in an equal manner. Maybe just one final observation is just to be careful about what kind of data is understood to matter when it comes to land in particular. We're talking about land data today. And what I'd say here is that although different members of a community, they may possess different kinds of knowledge based on their lived experience, when it comes to land data, it's often the knowledge of men that ends up being privileged for a variety of different reasons, right? Some of that just has to do with patriarchy. Some of that is maybe because men have had more of an opportunity to travel through the land because of their profession as maybe as hunters, for example, or as resource gatherers. And so male knowledge, there's a tendency for that to be privileged, but women may also have a different and complementary form of knowledge about the land, which is often just as key for thinking about decisions around land management or land use planning. So when designing this kind of participatory mapping methodology, it's really important to make sure that the perspectives of women, and really also that of youths and elders and the entire corpus of the community, is just as well represented. And sometimes that takes an extra effort in thinking about the project design.
Great, thank you, Ruder, for being able to put all of that, condense all of that in your short answer and all the different questions as well. I have a second round of questions, but I also see that there are other questions coming in through the Q&A as well. And Danik, I actually want to go to you next because there's a question from the audience members asking about your opening statement. The question said that you mentioned that data collection in Indigenous communities, at least I think in Bali that you were mentioning, they're done by women with some level of ability. What kind of ability, and I'm assuming capacity, are you referring to? Can you explain a little bit more? I guess the person is asking if you need to have certain level of qualifications or certain knowledge or certain, I don't know, access to technology or whatever abilities that they need to have in order to do the data collection. Can you explain a little bit more, Danik?
Terima kasih. Tadi yang saya maksudkan bahwa kalau pengalaman kami di Yayasan Wisnu, dari pengumpulan data sampai kepada tidak hanya dari pengumpulan data perempuan terlibat, kemampuan yang saya maksudkan adalah perempuan itu lebih canggih berkomunikasi untuk menggali data sosialnya. Kalau laki-laki itu dia jalan saja. Nah, jadi di situ berperan pentingnya berbagi perannya antara laki dan perempuan. Nah, jadi pengumpulan data itu lebih banyak dilakukan oleh pengumpulan data sosial, lebih banyak dilakukan oleh perempuan muda. Dan setelah pengumpulan data ini, mereka melakukan pengumpulan data, kami juga melatih mereka bagaimana mengolah data dari yang spasial, pengolahan datanya, dan yang yang sosial budaya, menuliskan bagaimana cara menuliskan data sosial. Jadi setelah ini terkumpul dan diolah, ini kami biasanya mengundang para akademisi. Seperti saran Lydia tadi dan Rudo, ini kami mengundang akademisi untuk melakukan analisis terhadap data yang sudah dikumpulkan. Existing dari spasial yang mereka lakukan, baik dari batas maupun potensi yang mereka miliki, juga sosial budayanya, sehingga tidak hanya dari pandangan kita masyarakat adat, tapi juga dari pandangan akademisi. Bagaimana sebaiknya ini direncanakan mereka. Nah, dari analisis ini kami akan duduk kembali, mereka akan duduk kembali antara anak muda, perempuan, tetua desa untuk membangun namanya perencanaan strategis. Di situ akan ada bagaimana mengatur tata ruang mereka. Nah, tapi tidak semua desa yang kami dampingi melakukan hal itu. Hanya beberapa desa yang memang masih sangat kuat adat istiadatnya, akan sampai kepada bagaimana mereka membangun tata ruang desa adatnya, membangun perencanaan strategisnya, sehingga inilah yang akan dan di situ keterlibatan anak muda, perempuan, dan ketua desa, ketua adat itu pasti ada di sana. Karena di Bali walaupun sistemnya patriarki, tapi peran-peran perempuan, suara-suara perempuan masih sangat dibutuhkan dalam membangun perencanaan. Gitu. Jadi mereka pasti akan dilibatkan di dalam setiap tahap untuk membangun pemetaan pengumpulan data. Setiap tahap itu perempuan ada, dan pasti ada anak muda, setengah tua dan ketua, pasti ada begitu yang biasanya terjadi di pengalaman kami. Nah, setelah proses mereka membangun pengumpulan data, membangun perencanaan, mentata ruang. Nah, kami sebagai pendamping biasanya sebagai pendamping akan mendorong ini kepada kebijakan pemerintah. Nah, tapi sering kali gagal karena pemerintah sudah punya tata ruang, tapi ya kami terima datanya, kami terima ininya, tapi belum tentu ini juga menjadi disinkronkan di dalam tata ruang pemerintah kabupaten maupun provinsi. Nah, pengalaman ini sudah beberapa kali kami lakukan untuk mendorong tata ruang atau tata ruang desa adat ini sampai kepada kebijakan pemerintah. Nah, itu yang beberapa hal yang kami lakukan, dan seluruh proses ini walaupun minim ya, keterlibatan perempuan tidak bisa kita kuantitas, tapi biasanya siapa yang bersedia dan siapa yang mau. Nah, itu yang biasanya soal kapasitas kami bisa latih. Yang penting mau dan bersedia dan punya waktu untuk hal-hal seperti ini. Nah, bagaimana tadi ada pertanyaan bagaimana perempuan bisa mengakses ini. Nah, ini sekarang di Indonesia sudah ada namanya SID, jadi sistem informasi desa. Jadi informasi tentang desa mereka bisa akses di kantor desa. Kalau desa dinas ya, kalau desa adat bisa diakses di desa-desa adat. Tapi tidak semua orang perempuan mau melakukan itu. Biasanya mereka mewakilkan. Saya butuh data ini, diwakilkan kepada yang dia percaya. Itu. Jadi bukan soal bagaimana bukan soal keterbatasan untuk dibatasi untuk mengakses, tapi keterbatasan memang kita sebagai masyarakat adat mengakses itu. Nah, itulah peran kami sebagai pendamping untuk bagaimana cara mengakses, bagaimana cara menggunakan data dan peta ini secara benar. Itulah tugas-tugas kami di lapangan, membantu teman-teman, memfasilitasi teman-teman masyarakat adat untuk bagaimana mengumpulkan, menggunakan, dan memanfaatkan data dan peta ini secara benar. Nah, kami seperti tadi yang saya bilang, kalau leluhur kami punya prasasti bernama lontar dan sebagainya, tapi sekarang zaman globalisasi ini anak muda menyusun prasasti digital. Jadi seluruh data yang dikumpulkan itu ya ada dalam digital, dan kami sangat menyesuaikan dengan, kalau soal spasial kami menyesuaikan dengan BIG, Badan Informasi Geospasial, yang ada di Indonesia saat ini, peraturan tentang One Map, One Policy gitu. Jadi itu yang sudah kami terapkan. Terima kasih.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much, Danik. Sorry to interrupt. I believe Betty has joined us from the field. Is that correct? Can I get confirmation if Betty has joined us? If so, would like to hear from Betty. Betty, are you there with us? Hello? Okay, maybe not. Let me go back to regular scheduling in that case, while we try and see if Betty is still able to join us in the last few minutes. Lydia, just very quickly, there's another question as well in terms of getting more youth involved in, in terms of data collection, but also just, maintaining and I guess land tenure rights for Indigenous peoples. Is there a strategy to have more people involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
yeah.
Yeah, intergenerational involvement in land-based data is really vital to this work. So we definitely are losing our knowledge holders and experts at alarming rates, but making sure that we have more educational programming about teaching youth about cultural sites, about how we refer to plants, animals, our non-human kins, all of that is really vital. But I also think that youth play a really significant role because they've always existed with these data ecosystems, these very rich data environments that we have today. So their vital role is really, how do we build technologies and infrastructures that support the needs and priorities of our communities, as well as survive within these digital environments. And I think that's the power of education. That's why I'm a researcher and a professor or a teacher, is because of those pieces. But also, it's that intergenerational piece where we need elders there to be able to tell us the pieces about the ecosystem that we don't know, or help us understand what was once there to envision what's possible. And so I think that those go hand in hand, and far too often, both of those sides of the spectrum, the elders and the youth, are often left out of these conversations, but I think that they play the most important roles. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lydia. Okay, we're going to try again because Betty apparently is online. She's just having issues with her audio. So Betty, can we check if you are around? Like I said, Betty is she's a Quechua leader. She was the president of Puerto Rica community before, and then she is now the first woman president of the Federation of Native Communities in the region of Loreto in Peru. And, Betty's known for being a very tech-savvy environmental defender. And, that's why we're having trouble connecting to her today, because she is out in the field doing the difficult work. Betty, can you hear us? And are you there?
Thin, I think Betty would need some translation, but she hasn't worked out how to do the translation. So
okay.
I don't know if one of the Spanish translators can just join and translate to Betty to figure that out for her. Thanks.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Yes, can we receive help from a Spanish translator, perhaps even on the English channel that Betty is possibly in, to see if you can translate to her how to select the Spanish channel? That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Then would you like me to help? I can speak Spanish.
That would be great. Just very briefly. Yes. Thank you, Diana.
Can you just repeat what you would like me to ask her? I'm sorry, Thin.
Oh, just tell her how to access the translation button on her Zoom so that she can then hear us and be able to speak.
Okay, and that's the question is for, the information is for?
Betty, for Betty, yes.
Betty, hola, soy Diana, estoy aquí apoyando, ¿me entiende? ¿Me escucha?
Sí, te estoy escuchando, Diana.
Betty, puedes seleccionar, abajo en su pantalla tiene un globito que dice interpretación. Si pincha en ese globito, puedes seleccionar el idioma que quiere escuchar. Entonces, si necesita escuchar español, tenemos interpretación y va a escuchar todo el inglés y los demás idiomas traducidos al español. ¿Lo encuentra?
Sí, sí, sí.
Ok, y ya está en el canal español, ¿no?
Sí.
Muy bien, gracias. Okay, then that's it. Betty has selected the Spanish channel.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Diana, for all of that help, and everybody else behind the scenes is making sure that this worked. Betty, very, very welcome to you, even though you're joining us in the last 15 minutes. We wanted to give you a chance to speak. We've been talking about, how to get Indigenous women involved in data collection and use and empower them. It would be great to hear some of your experiences in terms of some of the challenges for Indigenous women, and what are the things that can be done to improve the situation?
Ok. Buenos días a todos. Disculpen por la tardanza, pero fue el motivo de la señal, ¿no? Lo que yo les quisiera compartir es, ¿no? Que las mujeres indígenas, la verdad que es muy difícil o muy complicado de que nos den la oportunidad de poder asumir cargos, más que todo. No tenemos la libertad de poder estar representando, ¿no? a otras personas o a otras mujeres en espacios públicos, ¿no? Entonces, por ahí es una gran dificultad. Pero sin embargo, creo que si nosotros incentivamos a que más mujeres puedan capacitarse, puedan tener oportunidad de salir a otros lugares, a ver otras experiencias, a compartir otras experiencias con otras mujeres que sí ya lo están haciendo, sería como un reto, ¿no? Para que las demás mujeres puedan tener este tipo de espacio, aunque es bastante difícil. Pero sí, necesitamos que alguien vamos a decir, se hagan eventos, se realicen más reuniones y podamos invitar a más mujeres que puedan participar y así tengamos la oportunidad de seguir demostrando nuestras capacidades en diferentes espacios, ¿no? Desde nuestra comunidad, en nuestra localidad, y si hay la posibilidad, no tener reuniones virtuales así como lo estamos teniendo, ¿no? Entonces, sería un gran logro para que otras mujeres puedan estar al frente de las demás.
Thank you very much, Betty. Muchas gracias. So glad to have you. And thank you so much for joining, despite being in the field and having issues with signal. We don't have that much time, and we still have a couple more questions. And we want to make sure that we answer questions from the participants. And there's a question. Let me read it out. It says, right now, because the participatory and inclusive process is inculcated in community processes such as data gathering, how does this help women in securing their land rights, particularly in cases where they're not allowed to own or even have rights over lands? Do we have a practical example of how this process can help women? Lydia, I was wondering whether there's we speak briefly and you say you don't necessarily have an example, but you can talk about the general issues around it. So it would be great to hear from you. And Danig, Rudo, Betty, if you want to answer this question as well after Lydia, I'll come to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I just think that it's a really vital question, since today our conversation is around women and land rights. And I think making sure that we're really clear about identifying some of the factors of this, so that violence against the land and violence against women are interrelated. We see that in man camps, and up here, we see that with domestic violence issues. So this violence happening externally and internally within communities is a really important piece. But I also see empowerment, that I feel like it's these collectives of Indigenous women landholders that are happening. You see some great examples in the Bay Area of women-led land trust and buying back land as a collective that are really empowering pieces. But specifically in regards to these places where women don't have land rights, how do we get above that? And that's where I think that some of these economic factors and organizations that are wanting to support land back movements, really putting their funds towards Indigenous women-led initiatives. And I do think we often talk about the spectrum of Indigenous, but I think Indigenous women-led are really important pieces, because we're often the communities that are most marginalized in land discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I just wanted to, I have a couple more questions, but I wanted to ask if
Yo
anybody else wants
quisiera
to jump in.
complementar un
Yes,
poquito.
Betty.
Hola,
Yes.
Lidia.
Yes, please go ahead.
En ese caso sí es muy importante, ¿no? Que las mujeres puedan participar, ¿no? Como le decía, si hay organizaciones que están promoviendo la participación de mujeres, es importante eh, reforzar y fortalecer para que más mujeres puedan participar y así ganar más que todo, ¿no? El derecho al territorio. Si bien es cierto, las mujeres tenemos mucha vulnerabilidad, ¿no? De que podemos tener estos tipos de espacios, pero sin embargo, lo importante en los territorios indígenas, lo básico son las mujeres, ¿no? Porque siempre las mujeres están preocupadas en lo que va pasando dentro del territorio, ¿no? Y lo que van dejando en estos territorios para el futuro de nuestros hijos. Entonces, creemos que si hay instituciones que puedan fortalecer este tipo de organizaciones basadas en mujeres, es importante que lo hagamos para que así tengamos o demos más oportunidades a más mujeres que lo puedan asumir este tipo de cargo y estar en ese tipo de espacios.
Great, thank you so much. Rudo, could I just ask if you have any specific examples that you might be willing to share, if you remember any, you know, because the question was asking whether there are any practical examples.
Yeah, I think so. Just briefly, I can frame this question just in terms of, you know, mapping for land rights and tenure, which is also what we focus on at Cadasta. And, you know, I think there's sometimes a tension between, on the one hand, introducing a participatory mapping project that allows communities to map the things that are important to them and to really focus on those cultural values that were mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, also the requirements for formal land demarcation, which sometimes may feel like an outside imposition, something that comes from the state apparatus, rather than something that's reflecting the community's internal perspective on their land, which is, I think, kind of related to this question. And, you know, the two goals are not opposed, and there's some great methodologies that I'm thinking of from South America in particular that kind of speak to this, like the Plan de Vida approach, which starts by asking broad questions about what the territory used to look like, what it looks like today, and what we want it to look like. And these kinds of broad framing questions enable different community members to speak to those different kinds of things. So when you're thinking about what the territory used to look like, you're not just thinking about elders, but especially elders have a lot to offer in that perspective. Then when you get to questions like what it looks like today, that's where you start to have different members of the community, like for also women, being able to contribute on the nature of land management and what the community and the territory looks like. And then when you're thinking about what we want it to look like, that's almost a question that's targeting the youth, right? And the coming generations and the territory that we want to leave behind for the coming generations. So I think it's a really good example of an approach that can really frame the questions around land management and even thinking about land rights, because asking these kinds of questions ensures that the discussion stays focused on that Indigenous point of view of the territory, and it captures all of the voices, including women, but then it also yields concrete plans of action, right, about which parts of the land the community wants to map, protect and hold collectively. So it's a way of getting at land tenure and land rights while still making sure that you're answering those questions from an Indigenous point of view and getting all of the input from all of the different members of the community, including women.
Great, thanks, Rudo. We are actually running out of time, but there's quite a few more questions, and I want to take as many as possible. So I'm going to throw, you know, three, questions, and I will just let any of the speakers just take them, whichever one they want. So three questions, and I think they're quite interesting. One is, can somebody give an example of how community gathered data can be used, and what would women bring to that process exactly? That's number one. Number two, what are some of the risks associated with data collection by Indigenous women? I think that's interesting. Are there any risks, particularly, I guess, in, you know, communities where women, you know, are not allowed to own land, or whether they're very conservative? Are there risks associated if Indigenous women collect data? And the third one is, you know, inclusion. You know, how do we deal with this feelings where in some communities, perhaps women feel that things like land registration process and data collection and data usage is a man's role. How do we overcome that? So 3 interesting questions that I'm throwing at you in the last 4 or 5 minutes of the session. Example of how community gathered data can be used and specifically what women would bring. Second, risks associated with data collection by Indigenous women, and inclusion. How do we overcome perhaps the feeling that perhaps this is the role for men? Betty, I want to come to you first. Feel free to take any of these questions or you know, just one, or if you can condense all the answers in one go, that would also be great. And then Danik, I'll come to you after Betty, and then Lydia and Rudo, if that's okay. Betty, would you like to go first?
Hola. Sí, cómo lidiar más que todo esta información. Mira, las mujeres en mi zona donde que yo estoy viviendo, por ejemplo, nosotros estamos haciendo monitoreo en los territorios indígenas, dentro de los territorios comunales, ¿no? Y todo el espacio que nosotros tenemos a nuestro alrededor. Estamos presentando en asambleas comunales, dependiendo de la información que nosotros generamos en el campo, ¿no? Entonces, mediante asambleas se van tomando decisiones. ¿Qué priorizamos sobre nuestros territorios? ¿No? ¿Qué está pasando sobre nuestros territorios? De acuerdo a eso, esa información lo planteamos en asambleas comunales y se toma una decisión, ¿no? Para o para que la comunidad pueda gestionar de acuerdo a la problemática que encontramos dentro de los territorios. En el caso de equidad de género, ¿no? Las mujeres, muchas veces que a las mujeres no nos dan la oportunidad de poder entrar al territorio, pero es importante que nosotros como mujeres también hagamos el trabajo para así poder enseñar a nuestros hijos, conocer más a profundo sobre nuestros territorios, ¿no? ¿Qué cosa está pasando dentro de nuestros territorios? Y la otra cosa es que los, los conflictos o las amenazas que tenemos dentro de sobre estos trabajos que hacemos, ciertamente a nosotros como mujeres se nos complica hacer esta labor, ¿no? Llegamos a ser amenazados, ¿no? Por lo que nosotros muchas veces hemos denunciado, ¿no? Nos hemos pronunciado sobre lo que está pasando, el tema de contaminación, el tema de tala, el tema de minería sobre nuestros territorios. A nosotros como mujeres sí nos preocupa, y ese es un riesgo donde que nosotros que como mujeres, incluso a mí me ha llegado a pasar que he llegado a ser amenazada por estar siendo como vocera, ¿no? De la comunidad, desde la misma comunidad y defendiendo lo que es todo el territorio de los pueblos indígenas. Pero eso muchas veces a mí no me ha puesto en gran dificultad, ¿no? O no me ha limitado de seguir siendo o pronunciándome, ¿no? Porque a nosotros nos preocupa sobre nuestros territorios de lo que muchas veces se vienen dando, lo que es la ilegalidad. En este caso yo, no, ver la posibilidad de que nosotros como mujeres sigamos adelante y sigamos teniendo apoyo, más que todo fortaleciendo en capacidades para que otras mujeres puedan hacer la misma labor que nosotros lo venimos haciendo.
Thank you, Betty. Danik, your final thoughts before we wrap up to those questions?
Baik, terima kasih Tin waktunya. Jadi mungkin saya agak menambahkan sedikit terkait dengan agak berbeda mungkin di Bali ya, karena kami Bali ruangnya kecil sekali, tidak seperti teman-teman di benua sana. Jadi kami kecil, jadi seluruh ruang di Bali itu sudah terbagi habis oleh desa adat, dan di dalam desa adat itu bagaimana hak perempuan dan laki-laki itu kalau mereka berumah tangga itu sudah menjadi satu kesatuan antara laki dan perempuan. Bagaimana perempuan bisa mengakses apa yang menjadi haknya laki-laki, itu juga menjadi haknya perempuan. Jadi soal akses terhadap hak terhadap tanah itu menjadi satu kesatuan. Dan ada tanah-tanah yang memang dikhususkan untuk komunal, untuk umum. Orang Bali tidak bisa begitu saja lompat sini, lompat sana, tidak bisa begitu. Jadi semua sudah diatur mana tanah komunal, mana tanah pribadi, dan mana tanah diperuntukkan untuk fasilitas umum misalnya. Nah, hal-hal seperti itu di kami sudah diatur, tapi kadangkala karena kebutuhan pemerintah atas pembangunan dan investasi itu yang biasanya menggerus. Kalau kami sendiri di masyarakat adat cukup paham dengan itu, tapi investasi yang masuk ini yang biasanya sangat mengganggu kami. Nah, dan ada tadi pertanyaan saya mungkin apa risiko terhadap perempuan kalau misalnya dia tidak terlibat di dalam pengumpulan atau penyusunan tata ruang dan sebagainya. Kalau kami di Bali, mungkin risiko mungkin tidak dirasakan ya, tidak dirasakan dengan nyata. Tapi secara pelan-pelan ini akan sangat cukup menutup akses bagi perempuan. Kalau misalnya perempuan tidak aktif untuk melakukan, biasanya ruang itu terbuka, tapi kadang-kadang kan perempuan karena sudah kesibukan dan sebagainya, itu yang membuat mereka enggan untuk terlibat. Nah, jadi risiko mungkin tidak begitu besar karena kami tidak ada pertambangan, kami tidak ada ini, tapi di dalam rumah tangga atau di dalam rumah tangga biasanya itu akan terjadi sedikit gangguan. Kalau misalnya perempuan tidak aktif untuk menanyakan, ya tiba-tiba saja mungkin tanahnya sudah dijadikan oleh laki-lakinya, kan gitu. Hal-hal seperti itu di dalam rumah tangga. Tapi kalau secara umum di ruang publik itu sangat cukup susah untuk melakukan.
Thank you, Danik. Terima kasih banyak. Lydia?
Yeah, I think I'll just answer the question about what are the risks associated with data collection by Indigenous women. And I think I would just summarize that. I think it's recognizing the risks of being an Indigenous woman and going out into the world, and that there are risks that are always going to be associated with that. I've been out field sampling and got harassed and propositioned for things that made me really uncomfortable while I've been out field sampling in California, so I think it's recognizing that these risks exist everywhere. And that a lot of these are environments that weren't designed for women or for Indigenous peoples. So I think recognizing that those can be compounded risks associated in these spaces. And then when you go into places that also have more political contention, that those risks just get amplified. I hope that answers that question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Rudar.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to also the risks question. That's where my mind went to as well. And I think a lot about, data extractivism in general when it comes to Indigenous communities. Of course, historically, there's been a lot of that, which Lydia spoke to. And that's why the Indigenous data sovereignty movement is so important, when thinking about technology and methodologies and ensuring that communities are in the driver's seat at all times when it comes to their data and have full decision-making power over who has access and who doesn't. And I think the same thing applies to that of Indigenous women when it comes to their data. There's perhaps a greater risk insofar as potentially Indigenous women may not be involved in those final decision-making process of what gets to be done with the data. So even internally, there could be a risk of extractivism where, Indigenous women's data is used somehow for making certain decisions about the land, but they're not involved in those processes, right? So even I think internally, there's potentially some risks about that. And I think the best way to really mitigate that is just to enable communities to create their own data methodologies and solutions as much as possible, and to not rely on kind of outside approaches or tools. Those can be useful, but they're often not really serving communities in the ways that they want to and demand to. So I think that's one way of mitigating that, but the risks still remain, of course.
Great, thank you. Thank you for not only talking about the risks, but also how to mitigate them. That's really helpful. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We're 4 minutes over. We did start a couple of minutes late, so I guess, we're forgiven, but we do need to end the event right now. So, I would just like to say thank you so much to all of our speakers who joined from all corners of the world, despite bad connections, different time zones and everything. Can we give them a virtual round of applause, please, for all of their insights and to helping us understand this whole issue around data better. And of course, thank you to the audience as well for your participation. We would also like to thank our hosts at the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's been a real pleasure for me to moderate this event. Apologies for all the questions that we weren't able to take, but we hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation around data and Indigenous women, and that you will hopefully continue this conversation in other avenues as well. So have a great day, afternoon and evening or night. Goodbye. Thank you.